amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Brooks. We appreciate it so very much. And she was right, absolutely. I came in here looking around, looking kind of lost, and she said, "Dude, would you like something to eat?" I said, "I'm good." And then I came over and just said, "Dr. Brooks," and she's like, "Who are you?" And I said, I'm Otis Moss. And then she looked shocked. She's like, "You are young enough to be my grandson." And that's exactly what she said. Amen. Amen. So we thank you, Dr. Mother Brooks. We appreciate you very much. And I'm just so very delighted to have this opportunity to share with you during this institute. I want to thank a brother and a friend and also a teacher, Dr. Stephen Ray. When I was in seminary, Dr. Ray was finishing his PhD, served as TA. I learned theology under him, and has been a blessing in my life, and I thank him for the work that he is doing here and across this nation. And also another person who just recently received her PhD, who we deeply love and appreciate at Trinity, and has been a blessing, a graduate of Yale, Dr. Nichelle Guidry, and we certainly appreciate her work and her witness and all of the work that they are doing in the academic realm. So it is just my honor and delight to be here at Garrett and to raise some questions about if we are to preach and if we are to engage in this post-modern, post-soul world. What does that mean, especially for people of African descent, where whiteness has become, in many ways, a covering and, in some cases, a mimetic virus that has shaded the way that we literally look at the world. Richard Dawkins talked about the idea that mimetic is this idea that you can have ideas that can become viral, but they can literally invade the culture and then eventually invade the body, where we begin to think that the idea itself is something that is intrinsic in terms of how the world has been created. And so I raise this question: if black lives are to truly matter, an invisible people cast upon the floor of history, swept away by these romanticized notions of a country yearning to be a United States of America. We find the legacy of a people who are good enough to build this country, but not good enough to be citizens of this country. And if we in the 21st century are to seriously engage the idea of what preaching is all about, then we must come to grips with those who have been rendered invisible. Whether Patrick Henry was talking about give me liberty or give me death, he was not talking about Nat Turner. That he was speaking about one group that was not yet welcome in America. So shall we acknowledge the tragedy of our past? One of the things that American preaching has been afraid to do, has been afraid to engage tragedy and to face the blues of existence. We want kind of a happy resurrection preaching that never goes by the blood and the blues and the pain of Calvary. So we want this prosaic idea, this idea that everything is all right and everything's are neatly packaged together in 30 minutes, but life is messy. I'm a fan of Flannery O'Connor, who always says that the only way that you can understand grace is you cannot understand grace through something that is perfect, but it must be something that is grotesque is the only way that you truly can see grace. That something that is broken, you understand grace, but not through something that is perfect. And American Christianity has had difficulty dealing with the blues and difficulty embracing one of the great idols and probably the true religion of America, which is a combination of capitalism and in many ways white supremacy. That has been the religion that America has bowed down to since its foundation. And until we come to grips with this idea, we can never truly be truth tellers. Otherwise, we are just simply people who have been co-opted into a system where we become evangelists for a false gospel. And we cannot operate in that way. And so that we must be willing to face the blues. And that's something that's fearful for many of us because we have difficulty dealing with tragedy. But the beautiful thing that those of us who come from the margins and those who have been rendered invisible, we recognize that the only way that we can speak our truth is that we have to speak the blues. There's a great blues artist. He has a song. His name is T-Bone Walker. And T-Bone Walker says they call it Stormy Monday, but Tuesday's just as bad. Wednesday's worse, but Thursday's oh so sad. Friday, the eagle flies, and on Saturday, I go out to play. But on Sunday, you will find me in the church on my knees to pray. Now what T-Bone Walker recognized is that there can be no sacred and secular separation. That my blues from Monday through Friday are deeply connected to that when I move into the sacred space on Sunday. When I dislodge my blue note from what happens on Monday and Sunday, it then becomes easy to dehumanize someone or to own another person. Because what I say on Sunday has nothing to do with what I do on Monday, because they are disembodied, sacred and secular. But within the African American and African tradition, there is a merging of these things. In other words, my blues and my gospel have to go together. Now some will say, how do you get blues and gospel to go together? Well, first of all, you got to understand that you cannot have resurrection without the blues. You can't have resurrection without Calvary. Or the better way to put it, since we are in the Chicagoland area, everybody here has heard of gospel music, right? There's a brother by the name of Thomas Dorsey, we've all heard. Thomas Dorsey, we love his music. But the reality is that Thomas Dorsey was a blues musician before he wrote any songs for Mahalia Jackson. He was a blues musician down in Georgia, called Georgia Time, as a matter of fact, and learned this music, the existential music, the music of the street, the music that spoke to the existential experience of people, and then brought that to Chicago, and then began to write new lyrics. The beautiful thing about gospel music is that all gospel music is nothing but blues, but with gospel lyrics. Same chords, same melodies. That song people love to sing, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, that is a blues slow drag. So if you were to play those chords in a club in 1932, you would have a man and a woman sitting in the middle somewhere doing a slow drag, a slow dance in the middle. But all of a sudden, we have made it sacred by adding different lyrics. And part of the challenge for those of us in the 21st century is, will we create the kind of Jesus who has been so sanitized that he cannot get dirty and bloody in the street? And that has happened over and over again. So shall we tell the truth about the reality and begin to engage the blues? That there is beauty in the ashes, that we must have the courage to gaze in the abyss of broken promises and the atrocities of the historical record of our country. And we witness people over and over again rendered invisible by antebellum rhetoric, and antebellum rhetoric that is now being resurrected by a so-called alt-right. That the KKK no longer need sheets, they just need chinos and tiki torches from Pier 1. That's all they need now. And now they have a bullhorn that operates out of the White House that tweets consistently to give comfort to those who operate out of this ideology. And so the question becomes, can the preacher face the blues? And with facing the blues, there will be a challenge every time you preach them. The challenge will not only be internally, but the challenge will also be congregationally. Because there will be some people who will challenge you that said, I didn't come here to hear that. I don't want to hear you talk about the issues, that I don't want any tragedy. I want a 30-minute sitcom. I want to end and I want it to be happy. I want to go away feeling good. I want my best life now is what I want. This is my Bible. I am what it says I am. That's what I want right now. Y'all missed the shade I just threw. So that's what I want, my best life now. And that is what has become popular. That is what has become popular in American society. But that is not transformative. In terms of transformative, we have to be able to face the blues. And that is the one thing that in America we do not want. Because there is, in this day and age, a trajectory where people are now saying, if you raise any questions about America, you are now unpatriotic. We have weaponized patriotism. And we make raise the question that patriotism then therefore means agreement in everything. No. True patriotism is the willingness to say that I love it so much that I will critique that which I see. And I operate in opposition because I want it to be better. That's true patriotism. But it's amazing to me that today, as a matter of fact, GQ did a good thing. They gave a Citizen of the Year recently to a gentleman by the name of Colin Kaepernick. Great picture. Big afro right there. He's looking really good. But here you have a gentleman who has created, for some, outrage, not because of a domestic violence situation, not because of sexual assault, not because he sold drugs or he was caught shoplifting. No, not because of that. All because he took a knee. In the most violent sport in America, he took a knee, respectfully took a knee, and raised a question about if Black Lives Matter. All I want to do is quietly take a knee, a non-violent protest that is legal. And he takes a knee and outrage over the knee. Not outrage over any of the other issues, but outrage over the knee. And it calls us, how do we become prophetic clarifiers who can speak to the blues and not hide behind the veil of false patriotism? That is what is happening. So here you have Colin Kaepernick, who put his literal life savings on the line because he has now been shut out from the NFL. And now other NFL owners and players are joining in the protest. And I have no love for the folks who are joining in on the protest right now. I just have to be honest. Because no one joined in when Colin started. Well, there are a few. But the owners are upset because they're worried about ratings, not about bodies that are being brutalized. That's the real issue. Because the ratings are sliding. So let us now join arms together and let us protest. And then let us now focus and say it's about athletic unity. But you did not take a knee when Trayvon Martin died. You didn't take a knee when Michael Brown was killed. You didn't take a knee when Sandra Bland was killed. You didn't take a knee when there were policies around mass incarceration being put forth or voter suppression. No one took a knee. And many in the church couldn't face those blues. So we preached prosperity instead of preaching prophetic witness. A great opportunity lost in many houses of worship. And now trying to figure out, how do we do this? So by speaking the blues, we become the first thing that I'll share with you. We must become truth tellers and be willing, when we tell the truth, to take the hit for telling the truth. Let me say it again. When we tell the truth, we have to be willing to take the hit. If you do not want to be bruised, if you do not want to be hurt, If you do not in any way want to ever feel as if you are by yourself and alone, please stop with ministry today. Because it is a requirement that there will be some bruising upon your spirit if you choose ministry. And if you choose to speak the blues, there will be forces larger than you that will try to silence your voice if you choose that path. But that's a part of it. There's nothing you can do about it. As my father told me a long time ago, Dr. Nichelle, he said, well, if you decide to go in the ministry, you got two things you got to know about. The majority of the time, you will walk through the valley. Every once in a while, you'll stand on a mountain. And on the standing on the mountain, you will be able to see where you're going to go, but the majority of the time, you will be in a valley because you have a moment of celebration, or you have the majority of the time, you deal with struggle. The struggle in your ministry, the struggle in the work in the community, because you are dealing with the burdens and the heaviness of what people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor put it this way. He said, you need to decide what type of ministry you want. Either you want to be like Moses and have a headache for 40 years, or Jesus and die in 3. It's all up to you. One or the other. Those are the only two choices you have. You can have a long ministry and be sick and tired the whole time, or you can have a short ministry and be crucified. Your choice. But either way it goes, you are going to be bruised along the path. That is the key, that embracing that personal aspect of the blues, but also being able to speak to the public blues, is what the preacher must be able to do. And in this day and age, we are afraid of it. So as a result, there are now other people who have replaced the preacher as the preacher, because the preacher refuses to preach. So it may be a Kendrick Lamar who may have to preach, or maybe it's a Chance. Or maybe it's BYP 100 that has to be the preacher, because the preacher refuses to preach, because the preacher wants their best life now. They want to be successful instead of faithful. And no one has called any of us to be successful. One of the greatest preachers is someone who was an utter failure by the name of Vernon Johns. For those of you who are not familiar with Vernon Johns, he was the forerunner to Dr. King in Montgomery, Alabama. And Vernon Johns graduated from Overland College. There's a wonderful story about him. Anybody here know anything about Lynchburg, Virginia, or from Virginia? Right there we go. Okay, there we go. So he's from Lynchburg, Virginia. I believe this is the 1930s. He's planning to go to Overland, but he's only going to school about 4 months out of the year. And so he deeply wanted to go to Overland. So what he did, he prepared his application, sent it to Overland College, and then packed his bags so that he could arrive at Overland the same day his application arrived, so that they would have to deny him to his face. Because he knew that he only went to school 4 months out of the year. Because he's from the country, he was a sharecropper. He had to pick cotton and tobacco most of the time. So he arrives on the campus, and here's this large, kind of lanky African-American, and the dean is flustered that he's here. He said, look here, Vernon, calls him Vernon, says that we understand that you want to be here. We got it. I see your application. But son, you don't have the necessary credits. Vernon Johns then immediately says, do you want somebody with brains or do you want somebody with credits? I got the brains. I just don't have the credits. And the dean was very annoyed with him at that time and then said, well, if you want to be a part of this school, you have to be able to speak Greek fluently, read it fluently. And he scanned the bookcase and pulled down a Greek book and read it fluently and then said, do you want somebody with brains or do you want somebody with credits? He became annoyed again and said, if you want to be a part of this school, you have to read Hebrew fluently. He pulled a Hebrew book off, read that fluently. He said, do you want somebody with brains or credits? He was accepted into Overland, graduated second in his class, and then eventually served in Montgomery, Alabama, the church where Dr. King served prior to his arrival. And while he was there, every Sunday he tried to push the church into a direction of prophetic ministry. And he was eventually put out. Here are two the titles of two sermons that he gave. One was called, Is Heaven Segregated? Now, this is 1943 in Alabama. Y'all know what's going on in Alabama right now. This is 1943 Alabama. Is heaven segregated? Right on the door, right on the sign. Is heaven segregated? The second one that got him in major trouble is, here's the title of the sermon. Is it legal to lynch Negroes in Alabama? Yeah, that's right. That's what everybody else said. They tripped out. So the police showed up because they would come by every Saturday night to see what he's going to preach Sunday morning. Now, you got to be a bad preacher to have the police show up Saturday night to find out what you're going to preach Sunday morning. And so they literally arrest him, take him to the jail, and ask him, Vernon, can you tell us what you're going to preach on Sunday? The sermon about, is it legal to lynch Negroes in Alabama? And he's a very quick-witted gentleman. He took off his hat, and he looked at all of the officers who had sidearms. He said, I'd be happy to tell you, but I must tell you I'm a Baptist preacher. And before I can tell you what I'm going to preach, he takes his hat and says, I must first take an offering. And so they started to laugh. They let him go at that moment. But every single Sunday he's pushing, and eventually the deacons put him out. My father had an opportunity to speak to Vernon Johns when he gave the baccalaureate address at Morehouse in 1956. And he sat down with the students and he said, we want to learn about your great successes. And Vernon Johns said to every student, he said, I can tell you of no success. He said, but I will let you learn from my long list of failures. And he sat with the students and told them about church after church he had been put out. He said, I was faithful, but I was never successful. And that becomes part of the call if you choose to face the blues. That many times that you will not be successful in the eyes of others, but you will be faithful. Because in this world, we desperately need people who are, and this is how I define prophetic preaching, who are willing to face tragedy, but not fall into despair. That's all prophetic preaching is. If you have enough gumption to stand and lean into the wind and face the tragedy of the world and personal tragedy that those in the village are dealing with, then you stand in the blues tradition. And the beautiful thing about the blues, if you sing it enough, eventually God will give you a gospel lyric that will shift the way that is heard and the way that it is experienced. Tell the truth, face the blues, and no longer operate with ideas of success that come out of the corporate world, but we need people to be faithful. If you were to look at, for example, most biblical characters, they would not be considered to be amazingly successful. I'm pretty sure James and John, their parents were like, what were they thinking? I mean, serious. I mean, here you go. You have servants and have a boat. You have a trust fund. And here you go following this dark-skinned Palestinian Jew with woolly hair, walking all around the community. You leave all of this to follow this guy. And even their family, mom has to come by and say, look here, Jesus, you think you can hook up my sons with an appropriate seat? And he even raises questions and say, no, that would be difficult to give them a special seat. Not particularly successful, but faithful. And that's the fear for prophetic ministry, is that we have a model that is not based off of faithfulness, but is really rooted within a capitalist structure. So we see this mega model, that's what we want. We see the gentleman on TV or the woman on TV who is giving wonderful catchphrases and people are falling out left and right, but they're never speaking about justice. Could you imagine if Joel Osteen stood up one day and all of a sudden he said, Black Lives Matter? And let me tell you why. And then Joel Osteen begins at 1619 talking about the enslavement of people of color, and then talks about the second enslavement period, which was better known as peonage, right after Reconstruction, and talked about how 500,000 black people were re-enslaved, then moves all the way up to talk about mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow. You know how powerful that would be? Now, some people would clear out the church, but could you imagine how it would resonate across the nation? A televangelist, a former with prosperity leanings. I'm not sure if he's a prosperity. I don't know how to frame Joel. I'm not sure. What that would do. But the blues don't sell. They don't sell. You don't get invitations around the blues. You get invitations when I can tell you how to be rich. And so our president and prosperity ministry have the same theology. They come from the same school of thought. This idea that it's about me and using God as a cosmic ATM. And all you need is the right PIN number, and you will be blessed with what you need. Facing the blues, telling the truth becomes critical for our journey, this idea of truth telling. But the other thing that we need to recognize if we are going to face the blues is that we have to decolonize God. That if you're going to face the blues, not just speaking about tragedy, not falling in despair, but also decolonizing God, decolonizing theology, that there has been a colonization process where it's even difficult for us to even view conceptually, to see God in very different ways. So we are encased in a very Eurocentric model that everything that we view in terms of our spiritual walk can only operate out of a small peninsula that we call Europe. And that's the only way that we can define it, and even the images that we see. And this is big impact upon me and upon our congregation. We as a congregation, about 95 of us, traveled to Ethiopia, the only African country never to be colonized. And it's a powerful thing to walk into a church and to see an ancient church where the reference is not Rome. There is no Roman reference or reverence because they have their own pope, and he looks Ethiopian. And they say that we also have the Ark of the Covenant. Went by the church in Aksum with the Ark of the Covenant, met the priest who protects the Ark. And Henry Louis Gates, several years ago, was doing research on Ethiopia, had a wonderful PBS special, talked with the Holy Patriarch in Ethiopia and said to him, he said, you know, you all make the claim that there is the Ark of the Covenant here in Ethiopia. If you would allow us to come in and study, we could verify if you have the Ark. Let Harvard come in and study. The Patriarch gave the smoothest answer I've ever heard in my life. He looked dead at Dr. Henry Louis Gates, PhD, and said, we know we got it. And moved on to the next thing. In other words, I don't need you to validate me, is what he was saying. He said, because my reference point is not you. And I can operate within my truth and not have you as a reference point. And guess what? As a result of that, we then stand as equals in a relationship very different than when I have to reverence and reference you. Then it forces you to learn about me because I've already had to learn about you, which changes the dynamic of a relationship because the relationship is now on equal footing as a result. The decolonization of God, the decolonization of our theology, the decolonization of our mind. As Frantz Fanon talks about, dying colonialism and the wretched of the earth. What happens to colonized people? that you begin to reference your world by someone else. And every marginalized group has that challenge. Every marginalized group, whether you are dealing in terms of culture or color, or dealing in terms of gender or orientation, every marginalized group has to struggle with, will I reference myself by someone else, or will I begin to define who I am in a very different way? And that becomes a trajectory. And that is the power in reference to African American religiosity. Not today, but I mean when in 1619, the invisible institution, this was not just black folk performing Christian ritual borrowed from Europe. This was an Africanity mixed with a Christianity. It was a beautiful thing to witness, where a new creolization of faith comes about in America. I like the way that I think I heard Dr. Ivor Crothers put it this way, that there was the theology that was on the deck of the slave ship, and then there was the theology that was in the hull. There were those who stood on top and those who stood below, and something happened. A new theology was born. As a matter of fact, I could put it this way, that when we decolonize, we begin to see things differently. How many people here know the song Amazing Grace? I wish I was a musician. I could play it. Y'all know Amazing Grace? Anybody not know it? I just want to make sure. Okay, I can explain. Okay, just want to check. It's a very well-known American hymn. It is our Africanized hymn. Now, we tell the story of Newton and how Amazing Grace was written. Newton, a peddler in black flesh. All of a sudden, he's on a ship. There is a storm that happens. He prays, and at that moment, the lyrics come into his mind. Saved a wretch like me. We love that story. But there is another story that you can hear from the people in South Carolina and North Carolina, upon the Sea Islands in Georgia, who do tell you about the origin of that story, because Amazing Grace does not fit traditional European musical structure. It is pentatonic. It uses simply that 5 scale, those 5 notes, the chords that come out of the African tradition. And the story goes is that it was not Newton's prayer that stopped the storm. There were some West Africans in the hull, and they were moaning so beautifully that moan made its way out of the ship and made its way up to heaven, and an angel tapped God on the shoulder and said, "You got to hear these children sing." And God leaned over from the banister of heaven and said, "Shh," and stopped the storm just so that he could hear the children moan. Now, the beautiful thing about Amazing Grace, it is the only hymn that literally you can't play without the black keys. In other words, if you play without the black keys, you'll have grace, but it won't be amazing. You've got to merge them together. The way that it sounds is an Africanized music using the pentatonic scale. What is that? Those 5 notes. In other words, every spiritual in the African tradition, you can play it on the black keys without touching anything else, just using those 5 notes. And Amazing Grace merges the two, creating something new. And that's part of my belief, Dr. Brooks, why it connects with so many people, because it brings together that which America has never been able to bring together. The invisible and the visible. The marginalized and those in the center. And something about it speaks to us because we say something about it's right. It's what the world that we want to create, but we've never been able to create. It's Amazing Grace. The lyrics I like, but it's something about when you hear your grandmama hum it. It does something to your spirit because a sound is being produced. A theology is being communicated. a sonic resonance is going out into the world that the human vocabulary cannot completely capture, that speaks to the blues and the triumph simultaneously together. Amazing grace. The decolonization of God. And I'll leave you with this so that we can just have some conversation. That if the way to decolonize is for us to regain our moral compass. When we regain our moral compass and we become a people who are faithful, that we are unafraid of the blues and tragedy, we then are willing to engage in what I call the jazz ethic of ecclesiology. So what is this jazz ethic, this idea? Well, I'm glad you asked the question. I believe that jazz music speaks to, in so many ways, of what democracy should be and what our churches are called to create, the jazz ethic. So jazz music created in that beautiful and wonderful city better known as New Orleans. These Africans who come from Haiti, free Africans along with enslaved Africans, because on Sunday in this Catholic area, everybody was free to do what they needed to do. So the French and the German and indigenous people from that area got together, they heard their rhythms together, and all of a sudden a new music was created. It mixes together everything. And what is so powerful about jazz is it takes instruments that are not supposed to play together. So traditionally, the European piano that was not to play with the saxophone was designed for the marching band. The piano was designed for something else. And that bass was not to be played with your fingers, it was to be played with a bow. And that trap drum set was just to be used to keep time, not to create these polyrhythms in the process. No. All these things that are not supposed to play together, they somehow find a theme together. But what jazz does that America must learn is that jazz gives everybody the right to solo. Every instrument has a right to solo. So in other words, out of my own cultural narrative, I have the right to bring something to the table. And what I bring beautifies what I bring to the table. So you will never hear in a jazz band the piano trying to force the bass to sound like the piano. The bass never tries to oppress the saxophone or the trumpet. Everybody says, do your thing out of how you have been created, and you will bring something new to the table. And that's what, on a public level, we have completely forgotten. How do I bring the saxophone of the South Side? And how do I bring the piano of Evanston? And how do I take the bass from the West Side? And how do I take the trumpet from the suburbs? And how do I take that drum set that's right down there downtown? How do I bring them all together? That is what jazz does. And that is what faith in God is supposed to do. It's supposed to give you the nimbleness and the ability to appreciate the sounds that come from other people and recognize that ultimately those sounds and that music comes from God. When will we be a jazz band as a country where wherever you are, you have something to contribute to the table, and that you can solo, and in the process of soloing, you can even use improvisation. That doesn't mean you're making up something. Improvisation is always based on preparation, because there can be no improvisation unless there is plenty of preparation. So don't ever try to preach and do improvisation. You never did any preparation, because that's called mess. That's what that's called. That's just called mess. Because when you prepare, in other words, the jazz musician prepares and works the chords and the keys so much that no matter what happens in the process, they have an ear for the Holy Spirit. So let me explain that. I believe it was Kirk Byron Jones who told the story of Wynton Marsalis, who was playing at the Village Vanguard in New York in a small little venue. There he was, I believe, giving a solo. I think it was the song Cherokee. He's killing it. It's a small venue, and somebody forgot to turn off their cell phone. Cell phone blaring throughout the entire venue, little tiny venue, smaller than this chapel. And everybody's like, oh, shoot, messed up the entire solo. Boom, but it didn't hurt Wynton Marsalis. What Wynton Marsalis started doing, he started playing his trumpet at the tone and sound of the cell phone. And then worked that sound into his solo. Then brought it all the way back to the theme. And everybody who went to that concert said that probably was the greatest solo they ever heard in their life. Because of the preparation, he was ready for the improvisation. And that is one element that the church must learn to regain that jazz ethic, that if we are to exist within this space, that we have to do the preparation and do the work. The decolonization, and regain our moral compass, to be truth tellers, to be faithful, and to be willing to face the blues. So face your tragedy. Don't fall into despair. And let us raise questions about Black lives mattering in the 21st century. God bless you. Thank you very much.